Hello. Today we're going to talk about printing. Specifically, we're going to talk about what are ink and substrates and how are they different and how does that affect the different printing methods available. First, I think we need to understand the different types of ink that are available and how we interact with them. The most common form of ink that we all encounter is liquid ink, the kind of ink that we find in inkjet printers. This ink comes in small little cartridges. We load them into our desktop printers, and they're expensive. They're the things we use most commonly around the house or in the office. There are some benefits and some pros and cons related to using this type of ink. One of the benefits is that it's convenient and it's fast and pretty decent quality. One of the drawbacks of an inkjet printer is that the prints are water sensitive, meaning they can smudge and smear if you drip water on an inkjet print. It doesn't work very well. Also, they're not archival. They don't last a very long time. And the ink tends to bleed when it goes on paper. Also, the ink is expensive, so if you're trying to do in bulk, something like that, an inkjet printer isn't really what you want. But the convenience for most people outweighs some of those drawbacks. So this is kind of the entry level, around the office, around the house type of printing. Another type of ink which you can add to the system is for large format printing. This is still your basic run-of-the-mill inkjet, but it adds some additional features. The most obvious is you can print on large objects, large vinyl, large pieces of paper or roll materials. But one of the improvements is that with this kind of inkjet printing, we've added additional colors. And what that does for us is it gives us the ability to print more high quality, higher ranges or gamuts of color, so you can get really vibrant, beautiful prints at a very high quality. Probably the best photographic quality type prints you can get are going to be using a high-end inkjet printer or large format printer that uses some of these expanded set of colors. And you can see here we've got a light cyan, additional green. Sometimes they add purple and other colors to enhance the prints. So whenever you buy a canvas print or an art print, something meant to be archival, you're going to get it from a high-end inkjet press. Another cousin to inkjet printing is sublimation. Now, sublimation ink is liquid in its basic form, and it comes in a cartridge, and it gets loaded in what looks like an ordinary inkjet printer. The difference is that when you print on a dye sublimation printer, what you're doing is printing a transfer sheet. You're printing your image on that sheet of paper or that transfer material, and then later on you're using a heat press to transfer that image onto the surface of that other object. So it's printing in reverse. That's something to remember, that when you print on a dye sub printer, you're printing your images and your text in reverse because the image gets mirrored onto the surface of the other object. This is how printers are able to make these beautifully decorated objects, whether it's a phone case or an iPad case in this situation. You can put it onto mouse pads and puzzles and metal prints. All different kinds of materials are printed this way. And it's through that dye sublimation process. And I'm no scientist, but sublimation is some sort of gas process where the ink gets heated up to a high temperature, converts to a gas, and then on the molecular level bonds with the surface of the material, whether it's metal or enamel or some other type of surface. Keyword, substrate. We went from paper, now inkjet on a different material like acrylic or metal or wood, and that's the definition of a substrate. Okay, next. So if you want to scale this up into a commercial application, there are really large inkjet presses that have been adapted to run dye sublimation transfer sheets. And this is how you're able to create fabric patterns or material garments that are printed where the image goes from edge to edge, from seam to seam. And this is how they can create these really decorative objects, is by printing on large bolts of fabric, which are then cut down and sewn together into colorful, awesome t-shirts. That's how this kind of thing is done. It also increases the colorful range that you're able to print on the object, whereas typical screen printing, you're limited to the type and quality of the image that can be printed. But in this case, you can do a fully rendered image because you're dealing with those tiny, tiny inkjet dots coming out of the inkjet press, or in this case, the dye sublimation press. So if you move on from liquid ink, you're going to level up to an oil-based ink, something that has a little bit of a viscosity or a thickness to it, represented by these little cans here. This type of ink you scoop out with a little spatula and you apply it to your printer rollers. And that type of printing that requires this kind of oil-based or thick premixed ink is offset printing. Now, offset printing has been around forever. Offset lithography is the commercial process where you can take ink, apply it to a printing plate, which then gets rolled and passed on to a printed piece of paper. Now, there have been great advancements in offset printing over the years, and it's still one of the tried and true commercial methods for printing. It's fast, it's durable, it can be scaled up to thousands and thousands of impressions in a minute or an hour. So most commercial operations still rely on offset printing. But it too has its pros and cons. One of the cons of offset lithography is that you're required to create printing plates ahead of time, which means that you can't do changes, or it's not very convenient or easy or inexpensive to make changes to printed materials. Whereas maybe inkjet or one of the other printing methods, it's print on demand, so you can make changes as necessary. Or you can print smaller quantities. In the offset world, you're going to want to be printing large quantities if you're going to go through the trouble of setting up the plates and running the press. So it's really meant for high-end, large quantity printing. Next, another form of oil-based ink, which we get into, is where we find spot colors, premixed colors, kind of that premixed ink, similar to what you might find at a paint store, where you buy these large tubs of ink. And you may have guessed it, but this type of ink is most commonly used in screen printing. You need a really thick ink to work on fabric, to be able to be pressed through a screen and heat cured onto the surface of a garment. And that's where this kind of ink really excels. It's very durable, it lasts a long time, it bonds really well with polyester and cotton, and it makes for really awesome images. I mean, I'm a real fan of graphic tees myself. But it is a little hard to work with, and as you can kind of see on this stencil, your artwork or the type and quality of your artwork is limited. You have to break your artwork down into solid shapes to be able to make a really good defined print. Same thing with this type of printing. It's not quite as quick and easy as dye sublimation or typical inkjet printing is, because there's a lot of work that goes into creating your screens and mixing your ink and curing your t-shirts. So when you do these types of prints, you really need to be invested in doing a large quantity for it to be worthwhile. All right, last but not least, one of the most common forms of printing isn't ink at all. It's toner. I find it funny. A lot of times people say, hey, the toner's out on your printer, but what they're actually talking about is ink, or vice versa. I think people don't quite understand the difference between ink and toner. But toner is a plastic powder, and it's applied in an entirely different process to paper than inkjet printing. This process involves heat and pressure, where there is even a laser inside the press that uses static electricity to align the image to the printer drum and then basically melt the toner onto the surface of the print. And so in that scenario, you get toner cartridges. Now, one of the benefits of this type of printing is that toner cartridges last a long time. They're already dried up powder. They don't dry out. They don't wear out as often. So you can get by with buying one cartridge and it lasting a very long time. Whereas maybe your inkjet cartridge might actually dry in your inkjet press if you don't use it very often. But the drawback is toner cartridges are expensive. And running a digital press like a typical Xerox is not a cheap investment. But it is the most convenient when you're trying to do office printing and decent quality prints. So if you can get a color printer like this that can last a long time doing decent quality prints at a high volume, that's where these type of presses really come into play. Additionally, this kind of printing, you can do changes. It's kind of like on-demand printing. You don't have to do a lot of setup like inking plates and exposing plates and creating film and those types of issues. You just send your file to print and it prints. But in a commercial setting, these presses tend to wear out and break down, and they require a lot of technician work to come in and to replace drums and to keep it running at its optimum level. So again, pros and cons. It's good at a few things, but we have all these other varieties of printing to choose from when we need it. And as a bonus here, I thought I'd mention another type of ink that's not ink at all, but a really integral part of the printing process would be vinyl cutting. Now, this here is a photo of a vinyl cutter where you have pre-made rolls of sticker vinyl that have different spot colors available, and then the cutter cuts out the image, and then you transfer that image onto a surface like a sign or some other material. But it is possible to have these types of printers, cutters, combined with printers, where you have a printer cutter, where you can actually print a full color image on vinyl and then cut it out with a blade and create stickers or some other form of decorated material. So that there is a little rundown of some of the common uses of ink and different types of substrates that are available for printing. There are lots more. This is just meant to be a little intro, but these are some of the most common that you're going to encounter in your day-to-day life and as a printer in the field. All right, thanks for listening.